Hey, this is Rob Dietz.
This is Jason Bradford.
And I'm Asher Miller. Welcome to Crazy Town, where we enjoy the day because there aren't many left.
This episode was originally recorded early in 2020, before we knew much about the coronavirus.
Hey guys, I want to start today's show by pulling a quote out from the greatest repository of human knowledge ever.
Wikipedia?
Close. Twitter.
Oh, right.
Nice.
Wow. You're like our executive, our chief executive.
No better place to go to get erudite, well-thought-out, reasoned, evidence-based discussion.
You're throwing into a tough area people who are actually listening to this podcast to get some information. Just want you to proceed with caution here.
Yeah. No, so I really want to reference a tweet that was actually sent, directed to Richard Heinberg, who's a colleague of ours at Post-Carbon Institute, one of the kindest and most articulate people I know.
And scholarly as well.
Yes.
So here's a quote. It started because someone else quoted a piece that Richard had written. And the piece was called Systemic Change Driven by Moral Awakening is Our Only Hope.
A lot of big words.
Yeah, I know. Sorry about that.
He's a smart guy, too.
Okay.
So the quote that this guy pulled from Richard said, "Our core ecological problem is not climate. It is overshoot, of which global overheat is a symptom. Enormous amounts of cheap energy from fossil fuels enabled rapid growth, and in turn led to population increase, pollution, and loss of natural habitat."
Amen, Richard.
Yeah, I mean, obviously something that we would stand behind and agree with. But someone else read that and replied, "The relevant moral issues are global inequality, capitalism, colonization, racism, heterosexism, and misogyny. If the quote-unquote moral issue you name is quote-unquote overpopulation, you are feeding the logic of ecofascism and offering up the planet as an excuse for mass murder. So stop."
Ouch.
Well, I mean, that person, I can agree with some of their moral issues, clearly, but wow, is there a need to shut down the conversation here?
Well, apparently. I mean, it's interesting that the reaction to a statement that we would sort of view as not innocuous, but kind of a given would have such a strong reaction.
I had this may have occurred prior to Twitter. This was a while ago, so hopefully I remember this clearly. But I had a conversation with a guy. I was living in Mendocino County, and I was pretty active.
Where's that?
That's in California, Northern California, north of San Francisco, a rural-ish area with small cities and towns. Anyhow, there was a publication that I think was communist, socialist, communist maybe. I'm not sure exactly, but I got a call from like the editor of this thing, and he heard me on the radio or something, figured out what I was doing, and he was really challenging me, and he was upset with me for talking about what I was talking about. And I think he thought I was some right-wing nut job. And when we got to know each other a little, there was no tweeting. We just talked on the phone. It was amazing.
People do that?
Yeah, we used to do that.
Yeah.
We got to know each other, and it was like we kind of agreed with each other. Like we realized, okay, we could get along. We're not evil. And it turned out really what it was, what this person that was responding to Richard's tweet was like, he did not want the conversation regarding limits to deny like the proletariat what they're due, that sort of.
So all right, let's see. So you're saying by you going on the radio and talking about the limits to growth, he's like, well, now the people, the have-nots, aren't going to get their just desserts.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, he was concerned. Like, this, well, if there's limits, then of course we can't distribute because there's not going to be enough to distribute or whatever, right? And it would feed in then to right-wing kind of thought.
So he didn't want you to say it.
First he was challenging me on some of the stuff, but then kind of agreed, but didn't like where it led. And I was like, I don't like where it leads either.
Right.
It
doesn't mean you can't talk about it. But so yours, I understand the topics. I want to go back to not Richard's tweet, but the tweet in response to the guy who tweeted Richard's non-tweet, whatever it was.
Richard wasn't tweeting. Richard was writing an article that got tweeted.
For anyone who thinks that they're tweeting at Richard, just know Richard's really not checking his Twitter account.
Yeah. So she or he, whoever responded, was saying, stop it because you're feeding the eco-fascism. What are we talking about when we're throwing that word around?
Well, let's give a little context first. Like, why is that even a concern? It's a concern because we've been seeing really alarming incidents of terrorism. We had a shooter who killed an ungodly amount of people at a Walmart in El Paso, Texas. A little bit before that, we had a shooter who went from Australia to New Zealand and murdered many Muslims there. Mm-hmm. And
in a mosque, right? Like went into a mosque, right?
And in both of those cases, and I think there are other cases as well, both of these shooters had manifestos where they were proclaiming views that some would call, and in fact, the guy in New Zealand called himself eco-fascists, right? So like the El Paso guy, this is something from his manifesto, quote, I just want to say that I love the people of this country, but goddamn, most of y'all are just too stubborn to change your lifestyle. So the next logical step is to decrease the number of people in America using resources. If we can get rid of enough people, then our way of life can become more sustainable.
And that shooter's name was Thanos? Is that just wants to start wiping out populations?
Yeah.
And then the New Zealand guy, as I said, he called himself an eco-fascist and said there is no nationalism without environmentalism.
Wow.
Now, obviously, this El Paso guy, both of these people are sick human beings, right?
And not to mention just logic challenged as well.
Well, that's what I was going to say. I mean, this El Paso shooter, he's saying, I can't get you guys to change your lifestyle. He actually did talk about consumption, overconsumption, and corporations contributing to that. But he's saying, hey, if we can't get people to change their consumption, we're just going to have fewer people. But here he is intentionally targeting Mexicans coming over to shop at Walmart. Mm-hmm. And if you're trying to deal with consumption, maybe not the Mexican Walmart shoppers. Maybe
they're not the
owners of Walmart.
Yeah. There's probably.
I'm not advocating that. I'm just saying there's a clear logical. Right. He was looking for an excuse to go after these people. Right.
Well, I kind of want to step back and say, okay, let's look up fascism. Is this the right term? And so there's this guy named Robert Paxton. He's a professor of social science at Columbia University in New York. So, pretty prestigious locale. He's considered the father of fascism studies. So here's what his definition of fascism. Quote, a form of political practice distinctive to the 20th century that arouses popular enthusiasm by sophisticated propaganda techniques for an anti-liberal, anti-socialist, violently exclusionary, expansionist, nationalist agenda.
It's a lot of
There's a lot in there.
And
the violently exclusionary is what stands out to me.
And the New Zealand shooter talks specifically about nationalism, right? So believing kind of in a big state sort of perspective of things, a lot of a powerful, large, prestigious state.
And the idea of, using propaganda and rhetoric to really, engender those nationalist feelings, right?
Bring your group together.
And here's the thing. We are absolutely seeing the rise of fascism around the world. If you look at what's happened in India with Modi against Muslims there, I think you can make a very strong argument that President Trump is doing the same kind of propaganda. Anti-liberal, anti-socialist, exclusionary.
Well, and you can see some amazing examples of this on a smaller scale. The one that comes to mind for me is here in our region in the Pacific Northwest, Matt Shea, who he's a state representative in Washington, and the excellent podcast Bundyville, The Revenant, was the second season of the Bundyville podcast by Leah Satilli. Really goes into some depth on this guy, but he's basically trying to get a separatist movement of Christian white supremacist, violent, it kind of has its own little militia idea, and so you're seeing it pop up.
Well, with is that so much fascist, or is that more of Christian, libertarian? Christian white libertarianism. You know what I mean?
I don't know how to label all these things. I mean, it definitely has that violent exclusionary and anti-liberal, anti-socialist. So, it kind of depends where you draw.
But it's not
boundaries.
the big state. It's more of a...
Yeah, it's interesting because in those cases, there are, I think, a lot of people who espouse right-wing views that are actually anti-federal government. Right?
So they're more in that...
They're not nationalists in that sense, but they're nationalists in the sense of they want to effectively have their own nation.
Right.
Yeah,
they're a white
They're
nation.
miniature federal government.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. But I think we have to be honest that there is a troubled history, looking at the environmental movement. The reason I bring this whole thing up is that I'm concerned about is a fear that I have as we see more of these situations and this kind of rhetoric on the far right. You'll see people on the quote-unquote left dismissing some of these arguments and saying that anyone who talks about, limits of any kind are racist. You know what I mean? And I think we do have to acknowledge that there is some dark history to the environmental movement.
Yeah. I mean, there's the Madison Grant is a character, early 20th century, for example, protecting California redwoods he was into, and the American buffalo. He was the president of the Bronx Zoo. He did some pretty lousy stuff. He was a serious eugenicist, wrote books about, quote unquote race science, displayed a African tribal member kidnapped in a cage with apes. So really kind of said, the Nordic race is this great thing. And so basically he really has inspired a lot of the sort of modern eco-fascist folks. They look back to that guy as really one of these founders.
Yeah, and if you study your conservation history in the United States, you definitely come across Gifford Pinchot, kind of first head of the Forest Service, I think was his...
Yeah, very close with Teddy Roosevelt.
Yeah. Thought of as a hero, lionized. But he was a delegate to the first and second International Eugenics Congress in 1912, 1921. So you're right, this history of racism in the environmental movement is real. I mean,
even the Sierra Club, like in recent times, I don't know how recent, but I remember like in the 80s and 90s, I think there was controversies about people trying to take over the Sierra Club that had these kind of views, like at least local chapters, let's say.
And there's a lot of messy accusations that I honestly am not in a position to be able to parse around some groups, environmental groups that did have talked about population, issues as being anti-immigrant and having racist ties, in terms of funding and other types of support. It gets messy because I think there have been accusations also thrown at people who are not that.
Yeah. Well, everyone knows that Rachel Carson was in favor of killing as many people as she could. She used to go around to state fairs and actually booby trap the Ferris wheels so they would come off and go rolling down the
just to reduce population.
Yeah, I heard about that. Yeah, she was quite successful. Number of fairs at the time. Yeah, Aldo Leopold was into necrobestiality.
Wait, necrobestiality? Oh wait, so he was trying to preserve species just so he could fuck them later.
Yeah, exactly.
I think it was a way to prevent population increase. You're just,
right. If you keep it away from your own species.
Okay, we've gone off the rails a little bit here. Rachel Carson
took us off the rails.
And Aldo Leopold, as far as we know, were good conservationists. They weren't all eugenics supporting nut jobs.
No, but there is
a troubled history.
There's a troubled history, and I think that there's also been, in many cases, an overreaction and accusations made that are not actually based on people being racist or nationalist or any of those things. And there's a real concern for me, which is throwing out the baby with the bathwater in a sense, right? I mean, if we're seeing the co-option of some of these concerns, concerns about overpopulation, concerns about biocapacity, the use of resources in unsustainable ways, climate change, these things. If we're seeing those concerns being co-opted by the most extreme right-wing groups, there's a real risk of folks who find those views, right, abhorrent, dangerous, things that have to be fought tooth and nail. there's a concern that they'll just dismiss those arguments outright, right?
Yeah.
Because they're associated with those people, right?
Right. I think that's just because I think a lot of people who are ignorant actually about that there are real limits, right? I mean, the limits to growth came out, right? And it was widely, there was a lot of propaganda against the idea of limits, and the environmental movement has kind of turned to sort of, almost this eco-modernism perspective, touting the ability for renewable energy and the right type of consumption can solve things. Of course, in other episodes, we've talked about how that just is absurd and not going to work. But you have this interesting situation where you're getting all these stories that say we can kind of have our cake and eat it too, that plays to, again, the liberal, the left-leaning folks who want to share resources, who want to protect people and nature. And so they have a hard time accepting, I guess, like the guy I talked to who is the communist, they have a hard time accepting that, okay, if there are limits, what does that mean?
Well, I've got an example of one of the kinds of stories you're talking about. It's out of Harper's Bazaar. The writer, Jennifer Wright, I'll give you guys a quote so you can react to it. She wrote that if every member of the United States lived in an area with the population density of Brooklyn, New York, all 327 million of us could fit into New Hampshire. And then as a parenthetical, she writes, as someone who lives in Brooklyn by choice, I can promise you it's quite pleasant.
Yeah. I mean, this is what scares me is, you're completely ignorant maybe of the eco-footprint concept, the ecological footprint concept. And if you think of these cities, they're this high-density urban areas draw resources from regions that are several hundred times their own area. So if you're living in this...
where does she think her food is coming from?
Exactly.
Like everyone's window garden?
And where is your waste going to go to? It's not like you can just depopulate these rural areas. In fact, I wrote a report published by PCI, Post-Carbon Institute, called The Future is Rural, where I actually argue that with energy descent, we're probably going to have to redistribute out of these huge mega cities into more rural areas where biocapacity can handle things more for us. Where does food come from? Where does our waste go? Where does our energy come from? It's not really something that I think a lot of people understand or talk about, and they're energy blind. So that's sort of a false solution, in other words, and that's what scares me, is just promoting these. We don't have to worry about these things because we can just put everybody in New Hampshire. Or whatever.
Well, I think there's a couple of risks to that. One is, the danger if we're sort of blind about these limitations and the reality of what we're facing and what's required to actually live sustainably on this planet and address climate at the speed and the enormity in terms of the response that we need to undertake, that we're going to pursue false solutions, right? Yeah. And when we pursue those false solutions, people will wind up being disappointed. We'll have lost time,
right?
Treasure,
wasted precious limited resources,
right? And then and set people up for massive disappointment.
And then where do they run?
That's one risk. The other for me is that, and I just have to preface this by saying, I'm a person, a white male of enormous privilege, saying this. So I have to recognize to some degree that it's easy for me to say, do you know what I mean, and to criticize people who are pointing out, who are very, very strongly reactive to right-wing, racist, xenophobic, anti-immigrant positions. I don't face as much threat as other people from those things.
You can maybe put yourself in the shoes of the tweeter that we talked about at the beginning of the show. You could maybe understand the fear that leads to that kind of reaction. Maybe I don't
have to experience that. Although when you look at some of the eco-fascist viewpoints, some of it points back to Jews being behind all of this stuff. It's the Jews that are trying to. There's this theory of displacement that they have.
Yeah.
So you actually see this in right-wing circles.
Tell us about it. What have you been doing, Asher?
Yeah. So as a Jew, that I'm a little sensitive to that. This idea that Jews are the ones with their hands on the puppet strings. Of this effort to displace white Christians. I'll just say right now, as a Jew and a member of the Elders of Zion.
Yes. Well, George Soros, he's your buddy, right?
He is, totally.
Yeah.
Okay, we do have a plan. We do have a plan. But it doesn't entail AK-47s and AR-15s.
Oh.
That's all I'm going to say.
Okay.
No, I mean, so on a serious note, it's easy for me, coming from my position, to point out these limitations and concerns I have, but they're a real concern. And my concern is this, which is that if because we see the people who are espousing eco-fascist views, or even worse, taking action
being
as terrorists and other things, if we dismiss outright these very real concerns about environmental limits, about the fact that there's going to be migration of people as a result of climate change, and that's going to create lots of displacement and situations where communities are going to be buffeted by floods of people coming in because they've been displaced from some kind of natural disaster or another. If we dismiss all those concerns outright because we have some people on the extreme right who are espousing those views for their own disgusting beliefs to promote those, and we don't talk about them, or we tell people to shut up, stop talking about this.
Yeah, right.
All we've done is as these events become more and more common, right? And there's probably going to be more situations where we're hearing from these extremists. We're leaving people who are struggling with these questions to turn to those people only,
right?
Because there's nobody else,
right? You're at least talking about what my concerns are.
There's no more sane voice for the limits to growth, or looking at some equitable way to deal with these challenges. We've talked about shared sacrifice, where we all give up something in order to have a livable society, livable environment.
So I would posit, if you are really deeply concerned about the rise of eco-fascism, if you're concerned about right-wing rhetoric and the growth of these positions, we need to actually be talking about these issues and to own them, because they are real issues, and not leave it to them to own them.
Yeah,
right?
Become more literate in ecology and in energy and in resource issues and how those interact with societies and environmental change, and what the real stresses could be, and how would you, as a sort of humanitarian perspective, as a more open human being and willingness to meet others who are different from you and accept them and love them, how would you handle this? I think that's what people need to think through, rather than just dismiss people who are, because they have these abhorrent things and are willing to do violent, dismiss some of their legitimate concerns.
I also want to point out that if you are going to talk about limits to growth and energy descent you brought up earlier, Jason, like the idea that society has to run on less energy than it does now, you can speak out about that, but you can also be speaking out against racism, against xenophobia. Don't allow the conversation to go to scapegoating. And I'd say whenever we encounter that, especially if you happen to be, Sherry, you were saying you're somebody who doesn't have to deal with feeling the racism directly. Mm-hmm. And Jason, you and I are in that same boat. Maybe it's even more incumbent to go and say something when you see that happening, even if it's your crazy Aunt Edna or whoever, espousing her nut job views. You got to say, no, that's not, we're not going to approach this with that scapegoat mentality.
Right.
And the other is that there's a lot of pushback on population as a concern, right? I mean, that's what that tweet was talking about. You cannot bring up population because the truth is, in their view, the real problem is due to the consumption of wealthy people, right? In Western, quote unquote, advanced nations, in the global North. And the reality is it's a both.
Yeah.
Right. And so the other responsibility I think those of us have when we come from the privilege of being less at risk, right? Mm-hmm. And also coming from a position where our consumption is higher, right? Is that we have to own that and work on that as well, right?
Yeah.
So we have to live this change that we're talking about. So that means speaking up about all these issues and having honest conversations with people about the nuance of these things, because if anyone says that they have an answer, they don't have an answer. It's not the fault of this person or that person. It's not going to be solved by this technology or that technology. We're going to have to figure out how to muddle through this unraveling together, right? And that means being humble about this. That means being honest about this. That means having open conversations with people about it, and then calling out the shit that is absolutely unacceptable.
And you know what it also means? It means you better get ready to be uncomfortable. And I don't mean like because it's getting hotter outside, or even though that's part of it, but it's about the uncomfortableness that comes with having conversations like you just mentioned. I mean, you can't pretend that that's easy.
No.
We're such social animals. It's very hard to confront somebody or call somebody out or push a view that's not popular.
Yeah. And the last thing I would say to people is just be careful when you go to the county fair and get on that Ferris wheel.
Especially if the carney is named Aldo Leopold.
Yeah. Rachel Carson's granddaughter is there. Hey, to get more information or to stay updated whenever we put out a new episode, go to postkarma.org/crazytown and make sure you sign up for our email list.
So today's giveaway, if you go and sign up, we will arrange to have one of your children intern for Matt Shea, the legislator out there in Washington. Good luck with that.
Yeah, and to help them cope with being in that situation, we have 100 doses of ecstasy. Because with ecstasy, you can really just kind of get into and relate and feel love for anyone you're around.
Did you just offer illegal drugs on our podcast?
I was going to say that we would send people Richard Spencer's address so they could go to his house and throw flaming bags of dog shit at his door. That would be much more cathartic, I think, than...
As long as we don't have to process the flaming bags of dog poo.
We'll outsource that.
No, it's all compostable.
That's right. www.postkarma.org/crazytown.